episode of Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology. With me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Most biases are directed towards minority segments of a population, such as beliefs in the inferiority or superiority of certain sexes, genders, races, or cultures. But what if I told you it was possible to be biased against everyone, including your future self? While that may seem unlikely and nonsensical, the truth is that this particular belief system is widespread and latently implicit in many societies. Today, we're talking about ageism. So, I appreciate you wanting to do this topic because I wrote a paper on it this week for school, and I found it pretty fascinating.
Well, the paper was pretty fascinating, so I'm glad to have read it. Yeah, it's a timely topic.
Yeah. So let's start out by asking, what is ageism?
Well, we'll talk with that, and we'll combine a little bit of the history of the word, because this is one of those words that was coined in 1968.
Oh, wow.
So this is relatively new. It's a man named Dr. Robert Butler, and he was describing the reason he coined it in the late 60s was to talk about a systemic discrimination based on older people. And so he thought it was the next civil rights movement, which tells you something about the 60s, which I lived through as a little boy. Of course, never heard of Robert Butler or anything of that, but it's interesting to think that people thought that in that time, the other problems were just going to be solved, and so we could move on to ageism.
It's very optimistic.
Very optimistic. But essentially, ageism can be a number of things, as you point out in your paper. It can be stereotypical or prejudicial or discriminatory thoughts or actions against, or generalizations about a certain age. It can also, but it can be reverse applied, or applied in reverse, so that there's ageism about people in their 30s or 20s or teens, and anytime somebody my age talks about kids these days, they're applying a kind of ageism that's just as ugly as what gets applied to people in their 6th or 7th decade.
Yeah. So it is interesting that way, because I think that it started out, and I think most people who use the terms think of it as discrimination against aged people. And I think that that's true. But yeah, it really is. It's basically just making a judgment based solely on the age of a person, regardless of what that age is.
Age is a function of time, just of time.
Right.
X mark on the linear ruler means Y.
And you can I think that, there's probably not any age that's safe from that. Probably the easiest time period might be mid-20s to mid-30s might be the time you're most free from it. But there's still things, right? If you were attempting to, who knows what the kids are into these days, right? Maybe skateboarding, right? Maybe if I want to be a professional skateboarder at 34, people would be like, what are you doing? You're an old man, and, or that's that sort of thing. But for the most part, I think that it tends to be, aimed more at young people or more at old people than it does people in middle age. But I think it really depends on what topic you're talking about, what sort of area you're looking at.
Because there's so many kinds of ageism. I guess we'll talk about this.
Yeah. So I guess this question has already been answered based off of the age of the word, but is ageism, or the severity of ageism, a recent phenomenon?
The idea of age is as old as here go the puns, is as old as philosophy. So Aristotle wrote significantly about age, but more from the physical and from the applied, I'm putting quotation mark, science of the time, which is not our science. As we've established many times, science is philosophical. So it's not new in the sense of considering the time itself. Aristotle probably thought that time was grounded in age, and now we seem to think that age was grounded in time. That here are these demarcations as you get older, and this falls apart and whatever. But now we look at it in a very different way. So yes, it's been around, but the idea of coining a word to indicate that people are being discriminated against is pretty new.
Yeah. And I think that little history that you gave us is very interesting because, the 60s was a time where there were a lot of movements to, go out with the old and in with the new in a lot of things regarding, race or, all kinds of different stereotypes. The fact that, we don't know the founder of the guy who coined the term, and, some people might not even be familiar with the term, kind of indicates that it never got addressed. It never really got addressed.
Yeah. I mean, and within the medical community, I think it was starting to, then this gerontology has developed over, a number of decades, but still it's not all that old. And I think that it comes out of that. So gerontology being how we address age and developmental terms, medically with people. But they're all different kinds. Is this the place where we should talk about the kinds?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
All right. So there's institutional ageism. I think I'm at a point in my life where I can address some of these. Okay, which essentially means when any institution perpetuates a kind of ageism in its actions and its policies. Well, any institution that says people should retire at X age, whatever that is, has engaged in ageism for whatever purpose. Some of us experienced that in the pandemic. And an arbitrary age of 55 or older is chosen as, for various financial reasons, we can't afford to pay you anymore. So please leave. Which, that's one. There's interpersonal ageism, where people are interacting socially and things come up. Here's a quick example of that. I've had not my first, but probably my most profoundly direct experience of that in talking to a seemingly younger person by tone of voice and by vocabulary about an insurance policy that I was needing to cancel in order to embrace Medicare. and because I did not do a login properly the first time, the person said to me, she was seemingly solicitous, but really condescending. That, now, sir, you're probably going to be getting excited because technology is probably flummoxing you. It's, technology is very hard for people who are coming to be of a certain age. And I said, stop right there, because you're being insulting. I don't think you're intending to be, but you're insulting me with every sentence that you're saying. You have no idea what my experience has been. You have no idea how complicated and interesting my life has been, what tools I may have used, what I may be familiar with. And you're jumping to an assumption because I made one error in inputting data. That's, if that's how this call is going to go, I want somebody else to call me up because I can't do this. And she got really quiet. She said, I need to go talk to somebody for a minute. She put me on hold with nondescript music and came back and said, I apologize. It says here that you're 65, so you're not as old as some of the people I deal with. So I said, okay. All right. I don't think I got heard, but let's just finish this off. So there's that. And you can say whatever you want to as I'm going through these, but it's interesting to have experienced some of this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, we were talking a little bit along these lines before we started recording, where, what they're finding in the literature about aging is that the mindset and the prior experiences of the person play a great deal into how they act and how they perform at certain ages. So I've known several people who, who grew up, their first jobs were in technology back when everything was vacuum tubes and reel-to-reel tapes and stuff. But their curiosity and their intelligence and their career field kept them in the flow of that. And they'd show me things about how to use, features of my smartphone that I didn't know existed,
Of course,
or features
because there's
of my
always
computer.
more to learn.
Right. So, that would be a good example of ageism. What you brought up is just the fact that somebody said, oh, well, based on the age, this person isn't going to know how to use technology. However, there is something to point out there, which is that there does tend to be, as people age, they've found you have two types of knowledge. You sort of have a working plastic kind of memory. You have crystalline memory, which is memory for facts and figures and these sorts of things. They found that your crystalline memory increases throughout life, even into your 8th or 9th decade, that can increase. But the plastic working memory tends to become a little bit more rigid with time. And we're not talking significant, but usually by the time you get to be 70, you're losing something like 1% a year after the age of 65 or so.
Yeah.
So, okay, you get to be 90.
The decline.
you get to be 90 and you're at 75% of your working memory, which is still a pretty significant chunk.
Yeah, if you had 75% shields on the Enterprise, it was still pretty good.
You're not doing too bad. But that aspect of it has to do with learning new novel things, right?
Yeah.
So if you do see older people struggling with phones or whatnot, maybe that plays into it a little bit. But I think that the bigger part of it is not the physiological realities of decline so much as the psychological aspects of the person and how they've traveled through their life and the things that they've experienced and how they approach different things.
Which is well said, which is essentially internalized as well as externalized ageism, but internalized in the narrative and the things that you tell yourself. And that mundane little example I gave about being talked to on the phone, what I didn't like, that I recognize that this can be, I've all the way through life, one can feel defensive, but the rapidity with which my shields started going up, as if, all right, now I've got to start asserting. Now we've reached the time in life where you got to bark back or push back at the same time that you realize every single day I'm learning new things. So there's this, don't tell me who I am, but there's also, I did make a mistake on inputting that data, but I think that was whatever one attributes it to. I don't think it was, I know it wasn't an unfamiliarity with logging in on a system. And so that defensiveness, I think, in people can become a rigidity of its own kind. And I think it's understandable, but it still needs to be resisted.
Yeah. We've, we joke around about, Amanda and I, about certain people in our lives who say, well, why'd they have to go and do that? And I think that it's really a surface level assessment, right? It's saying, well, they changed something and now it's harder. And you go, well, maybe they changed something and it's just going to take you a little bit of time to get used to it, and it's actually better than it was, So yeah, there's a lot of aspects to it. Why do we discriminate based on age? Why do you think this? Do you think it's just based upon how physiological changes happen, or do you think that there's more to it than that?
I think it's based on the visual, but I also think it's very, very complicated socially, psychologically, for some of the things that you've just said before. There is, and it's not unbearable, and sometimes it feels that way sometimes, but a totally natural assertion of one's prime. in generational terms. But I'm trying to tread even carefully saying this because I don't want to be ageist in reverse. But still, I mean, obviously, we as we get older, if we've lived the way that some of us thought we should live, and this is not a universal, we're trying to make room and step back, not out, but back, so that next generations, plural, have space in which to figure themselves out and apply new ideas and new approaches that might not have occurred to us because we didn't have all knowledge, and new knowledge is constantly being formulated. And so it's not saying, well, I'm going to step out of the picture because I'm irrelevant now. Relevance isn't really the issue. I knew somebody once who was afraid of being old because he was afraid of growing irrelevant. That's not my thing. I'm not sure I ever was relevant except to the people I love. But I think that there's a realization that one can contribute in however small ways an individual life ever does contribute. But one has to take opportunities. I mean, William Shatner, the guy's in his 90s now. He writes books. He writes music. He does, and he ghost writes books. But the fascinating thing about what he has said consistently, even though he can be Shatner with a capital S and putting people off, whatever else, is when he's most sincerely saying, I've almost never said no to an opportunity. And I think that's why I know I'm old, he says, but I still feel young. And I'm so grateful for that. And I think that's the walking, talking paragon of what we were talking about even before the recording, that you don't have to grow old in all ways in the sense of any negativity. Yes, there's negative and illness happens and disease happens. And I'm not trying to rosy lens that. Of course, that's true. Any one of us, we don't know. None of us knows what's going to happen. But being open to opportunities, even if or especially if they seem a little off-putting, I think, and it's been my experience, I'm not Shatner, but I had a wonderful former student, now become dear friend, who invited me to do a podcast. Wouldn't have occurred to me to do a podcast. Keeps me vital, keeps me studying philosophy, keeps me realizing that we have a conversation. You and Amanda and I have a conversation, that we have a conversation every week, which is one of the best parts of the week, and makes me go back and read other things. And I get to read your papers, and I have graduate students who I didn't know 8 months ago who are sending me their papers because of, and so, or I get asked to do some kind of, do some acting or be part of a production of some kind with a local theater company, Shake on the Lake, or a dance studio where somebody needs a character to walk out on stage. Sure, I'll do that. I think that it's that kind of thing that makes one feel younger. So I don't think one has to be ageist. But like all isms, people who say they're not racist, of course, we are racist. It is built into us. We have to constantly, but we're not universally and at every moment, unless we choose to be. But we have to think about it. Well, ageism, we have to think about it. If I'm about to launch into some kind of tirade about people who are 18, shame on me. It's wrong. You can't. Do I want to be categorized with every person I know who's my age? Of course not. But it takes thought.
Yeah. And there's interesting stuff happening in the academic world around this. What they're finding is that the wrong way to think about it is in kind of these stage theories, like Erik Erikson's talking about, these conflicts between things, right? To think about, I struggle because, I'm too old for this, but I'm too young for this, or I want to have this happen, but I don't want to appear this way or that sort of thing. Really, it's more like what Shatner was saying, right? When you're getting to you're getting to a certain age, rather than thinking, oh, well, am I irrelevant? Am I too old to be relevant? Am I, what's the next step? All these sorts of things. It really is about looking at opportunities and, using yourself as a measuring stick. And that's kind of what we were talking about before the show started was, it's unhealthy psychologically and physically to think, well, I'm never going to get old. Everything is always going to remain.
That's ridiculous.
But it's also psychologically unhealthy to think, oh, well, as soon as I hit this certain number, 40 or 55 or 65 or whatever it is, something's going to inevitably happen. There's, everybody lives a different life. Everybody has different things that are contributing to the aging process. But some of the literature that I've found shows that your attitudes on aging can actually correlate to major diseases like cancer or hypertension or, heart disease, some of these other things. And of course, correlation is different from causation, right? So you're not saying that, oh, well, being more optimistic is going to prevent you from getting these things. But what they find is that people who have a more realistic outlook on the process of aging and of becoming older, they tend to have less of these problems, and I think that that's an important aspect of this is not saying, well, age is just a number, right? No, we're all going to die, we're all going to grow old, and I think that just that little tidbit of information should be enough to shape somebody's views on ageism, right? If you think that somebody's too old to do something, you have to say, well, someday, if I'm lucky, I'm going to be that age, right? And do I want somebody to tell me that I can't do something?
Right.
One of the studies that I was looking at was the media portrayal of elderly people during the COVID pandemic, right? And how in an attempt to protect older people because they were more susceptible to the disease, the media ended up portraying them as being vulnerable and frail and this sort of thing, and asking young people to sacrifice their social lives and their other things in order to protect the old people, which bred resentment in young people for old people and kind of propagated ageism. And, it goes to show you how complex the issue is, right? You want to, okay, well, part of getting old is you're more susceptible to this particular disease. But again, each older person is going to have a different immune system, right? The real age, right? They have ways of measuring this now via different breath and blood tests and things. Your chronological age versus your biological age can be decades different, right? And so making blanket assumptions or blanket statements in the media about specific age groups is, it's really, there's young people with diabetes or with other conditions that make them vulnerable to COVID, but you didn't hear about that as much.
Right. It's everything you've just described is I'm filtering it and boiling it down in my head. It's the same problem we have with so much in our culture. When we actively ignore or refuse knowledge, scientific knowledge, whether it's psychological knowledge or physiological knowledge or socio-political knowledge, when we refuse to accept it. Thus, huge swaths of people will not do inoculations. And we get back into situations where measles and so on can be a plague again because we've ignored what we once knew, what we once learned. Now we've decided to ignore it because humanity seems to be capable of that across a generation or less, which is really sad. It's amazing that we've gotten this far. But we have the capacity. We certainly have the capacity to recognize the complexity, the factuality of science and medical knowledge, the complexity of that you were just describing about biological versus social age?
Chronological
age. And so we just have to try to pay more attention to that. I mean, I think that sometimes people assume, they just assume, oh, you're getting older, so you're going to forget things. Well, maybe so. That doesn't mean you've become incapable of thought. You may search for a word. I've told people I've been old since I was 18 because I've always searched for words. That's why I became a language person, because I love using the dictionary. I think that that itself is humbling because it reminds you of how many words there are and to keep propagating every day. So it's not necessarily a lack. Alas, a lack. I think it is that it is a presumption. And it's a presumption to think things about how any other human being feels in the moment, in the condition in which they live. Whenever we say, oh, well, I know how you feel, probably we don't.
Yeah, it's an extremely complex issue because there's a lot of very subjective variables that are going on. I mean, okay, so chronological age, that's set in stone, right? Anybody at a certain chronological age is the same chronological age as somebody with the same number. But even that, based off of, genetic or lifestyle factors, okay, is going to be a little bit different. Then you have, biological age, which is the thing that's influenced by those things. So somebody who, gets enough sleep and exercises and has a good social life and eats well and all this other stuff, those effects over time kind of compound, and they might be physiologically much younger than somebody who's the same chronological age. And you have subjective age. The interesting thing about subjective age is that this almost universally decreases as time goes on. So, which is to say, even somebody who has poor biological age, right? Let's say that I'm 60 years old, but I have the body of a 70-year-old. My subjective age is still likely to be 53, 52, 7 or 8 years younger than my chronological age. But the subjective age also decreases more if the biological age is low. And it really is about, in the studies that I've been looking at, it's about that much. Somebody who is 50 years old, they tend to think they're about 7 years younger than they think they are. And as time goes on, that gap continues to increase until, you get up to the age of 80 or so and you think you're in your late 60s, right? That's an important insight. That's an important empirical insight into how we're treating older people, right? Is this idea that when you're talking to somebody that you think is old from your subjective viewpoint, that person does not think of themselves the same way that you do, right? And I think that that's an important thing for...
Deeply important.
Yeah, and we were talking about this a little bit before the show. Having functionality. Functionality is very important, right? So my mom is 71, and she's become more active over the past year or two than she was in the past. She's going to Silver Sneakers. She's doing a little bit more physically intense household chores and stuff. And sometimes one of my siblings is going to be a hard time saying, "Don't you feel bad that mom did that? She should be getting a hold of you and letting you know to do that." I said, "No," I said, because the more mom can do on her own, the more mom will be able to do on her own the older she gets. If we put a chairlift on her stairs and, do all this stuff when she doesn't need it and she gets used to it, she will lose the ability to do the things.
This is wise on your part. The one of the most inhibitory and I think debilitating social assumptions is this very thing that you're talking about. I've experienced it with parents and parents-in-law, where people jump to you got to keep them safe. Them, right? That group, you got to keep them safe. Why? What do you mean by safe? And for some people, that means putting them in a room covered with foam so they can never trip, slip, fall. But we all fall. We all trip. And to try to protect somebody from anything is just as debilitating as trying to constantly protect a little one so that they never stretch and never take risks. And the result is not good. And I think that it can be viewed as insulting. But I think if you even put the emotive part of it aside, it is harming a person. You're probably, not to leave sharp objects everywhere because you hope somebody's going to hurt themselves. Not in a malign sense. But,
yeah, I think that the way, and I don't think that this is a scientific term, right? But I'll use it, is it's over-adaptive is the way that I think of it, right? Because humans are adaptive creatures, right? So what that means is that we want to find the most efficient way of surviving, right? And so if we find an easier way to eat or a more frequent way to eat or a more calorie dense way to eat, we take those routes. If we find an easier way to do a task, we take that route. And we can see the harmful effects of that in American culture, right? Every once in a while it drives me nuts. I'll drive with somebody in a parking lot and they just drive up and down the aisles looking for a parking spot that's next to the door. Whereas me, I find the first open spot that I see in the back, right? And then I just walk. And the truth is I probably get there faster than the people driving up and down trying to get the spot close to the door.
I worked with a lot of people that felt the same way about a college parking lot. Well, we're faculty. We should have the president has his own designated place right up next to the building. We should have those too. Why? I can walk in the morning. I can get my head on straight. I can walk in. It gives me air. It gives me a wind. It gives me blizzard. Yes, it's a challenge. But you come in the door saying, "Oh, okay, now I'm awake and ready."
Right?
Yeah, you're right. It's annoying.
So we're adaptive because our ancestors, and we faced adversity, and so the way that your physiology adapts to adversity is to try to find the easiest ways to accomplish things. But what that doesn't take into account is that adversity is an important part of survival, right? And so you have to have, in order to have a healthy life, and whether it's physically or psychologically, you have to have some adversity, and you have to have some adaptive. You have to put your adaptive skills to use to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And psychologically, obviously, that doesn't mean emotionally. You negative emotions are bad, but intellectually, right? You need to be challenging yourself. You need to be putting. You need to have some kind of struggle in order for your body to maintain a peak shape as you age. But,
mm-hmm.
So, are there appropriate reasons for age discrimination?
Well, we can look back and say Aristotle didn't have them. Have you read?
No, I haven't. Stuff?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Aristotle has brilliance, of course, in many things, but from his view, from the science of the day, decline is caused by a cooling of the body. As the body cools, it deteriorates. So, and plenty of people say, well, I need an extra sweater now. My body's cooling off. Okay, so I think that's where it comes from. But, he says there's youth, there's deterioration, and then there's prime age. And so you're in your prime. But that's not helpful. So it's interesting. But ask the question, because
are there appropriate reasons to discriminate based on age?
To discriminate based on age? Well, there are appropriate reasons to say if the only access to a building is a huge flight of stairs and somebody is in a wheelchair, yes, it's appropriate to make a discrimination, which is not the same thing as being the loadedness of the word to discriminate, always to the negative. When discriminate itself means to make choices, to discern.
Right.
Okay. So, yeah, it's appropriate to discern conditions by which people have equal access. It's appropriate to discern that people who have walkers there's a case where somebody might need to park closer to a building, and that's why we have some special slots, right? So I think that there is some appropriateness.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that more often than not, it's applied on the younger end of the age spectrum, right? So we have child labor laws. We discriminate and say,
which we have been doing terribly.
We talked about that on the last episode, yeah. But child labor laws. You sent an interesting article to me this week talking about, how some of these laws are, they're definitely necessary, but how we determine them is very interesting, like voting, right? Because you can have an 18-year-old that doesn't know anything about politics and he can vote. Or you can have a 17-year-old that's very well versed in politics, but he's deemed too immature to vote, right? And you go, okay, well, it seems like there should be an age discrimination of some kind. You don't want a 4-year-old going to the poll and just pulling levers, right? But where do you draw that line, right?
And how do you draw the line? Do you have a literacy test for systems? I would love that. Here, let me take a literacy test. I'm 16. I can tell you more about how Congress works than half of Congress right now.
Right.
which assumes that I love this. People are complaining about a situation that's been taking place, and they assume that one service, one department is subsumed by another department, and they're completely separate, so that there wouldn't be discrimination going on. So there are people in government who don't know how government works. So I'm saying, sure, 15-year-old, 16-year-old can take a civics test. Let them. We don't pull the buttons anymore. Let them fill in the little blank with the number 2 pen or whatever pencil. And yeah, why do we do this?
Yeah, it seems like that would be it really changes the nature of the question, right? Because this idea of, what is an appropriate thing to discriminate on age about really kind of opens more up to this idea of maybe we'd be better off if there was a graduated level of access, right? Voting, I think, would be a good example where you say, okay, well, maybe, for instance, your brain doesn't fully develop till you're 25. Maybe 25 is now the voting age. But between the ages of 21 and 24, you have to demonstrate this skill. Between the ages of 18 and 21, you continue to sort of increase the barriers to entry, so that, sure, maybe a 16-year-old could vote, but they would have to pass a rather extensive civics or literacy sort of exam in order to prove that they had the mental faculties to vote. And of course, a lot of people would say that it's unconstitutional. It's a meritocracy of some kind. But that's why we have a philosophy show, is because we can examine the merits of that.
The merits of the meritocracy. That's right.
Yeah, and maybe that you could design similar things in other areas as well. And maybe that that you could make the case that's what happens at the older end of the age spectrum, right? With a handicap sticker. A handicap sticker doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your age so much as your functionality.
Right.
But there's some of that missing with the driver's license, right? Some people are saying we should really be retesting some of these older people for driving skills rather than giving them their license one time and saying that they're good.
I think all of us, because I just like to flummox the people who think that they're freedom for everything and all. This is freedom. Freedom is responsibility. I think all of us should have to go take a test. You could graduate the years, but I think people my age, people your age, 18 years old, you should, whenever you get your driver's license, you should have to retest, and not just for your eyes. You should have to retest. We're driving around murder machines. We're driving around in bubbles with our sound systems and these little worlds all into themselves. And that's dangerous.
Mm.
And we should have to prove that we can do this over and over again.
Yeah. This is a very interesting philosophical discussion, and I'm sure that there's plenty of listeners that are like
getting upset.
Yeah. Which is my favorite part of the episode is when I know that there's people out there and they're falling all over the spectrum on what they think about what we're saying.
But, and it's not a punitive thing. What is this notion that we learn to do something once and we know how to do it just as well as it can possibly be done all of our lives? We know better than this in all things.
Yeah, and it really raises the question of the importance of individual liberty versus societal functioning, right? How the individual fits into society.
Yes.
And, and what the role of government is in facilitating those two things. And so, yeah, when you see that there's reports coming out of children working in factories or of, an 86-year-old running over 6 people in Florida or something, it makes you go, well, is our form of government, is the way that we're instituting some of these rules as effective or as efficient as it could or should be, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Why is youth valued over age, do you think? Or do you think that it is?
Well, I think that's a really complicated question. I don't want to sound like I'm treating it in any glib way, because I'm not. I mean, let's go down or up a scale or all over the place. Youth is valued over age because one wants the next generations, plural, to have a chance to flourish and to live and to experience. Because why else are we here? I do not operate under the notion that we're here in order to learn how to behave so that we don't burn forever or so that we get to sing forever. That I don't buy it. So why are we here? We're here to experience life. We're here to experience life in any ways that seem that should be not gauged, I think, nearly as much as they are. So there's that. Yes, youth is valued because youth is prettier. Right? It's not all those wrinkles, not all those age spots. I always tell my granddaughter that I'm turning into a snow leopard, and she really likes this. There's that transformational thing. People creak even when they're in their 20s and 30s. Joints creak, but they creak more when you get older sometimes. Not always. It's that not always thing again. I think we value it for the energy that is perceived, not always that is there. It's all these perceptual biases so that we don't actually see the person themselves. And the word I just said, pretty, I meant that to be controversial because look at all the magazine covers. This is how people are supposed to look. You can go to a grocery store your entire life and berate yourself your entire life because whether you're 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, all the magazines, you're never going to measure up.
Yeah.
Right. And so we do this to young people. We've caused young people horrific problems by doing it. We've oversimplified. We've set a paragon of visuality that cannot be achieved by a lot of people, nor should it be. And so we wreak havoc right, left, and center with these notions. But we do that because this is how we wanted to think that we were, and we know bloody well we weren't, most of us.
Yeah.
So it's a delusion that we send ricocheting backward down the generations.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that a lot of it is surface level and illusory, right? I remember, I'm into fitness. So, and I try to keep that pretty well balanced, right? I do yoga for flexibility, and I run for endurance, and I lift weights for strength, and I like doing a bunch of different things, just to try to stay in shape. And everybody watches the superhero movies, right? We see the Marvel movies and these huge guys and stuff, and people think these guys are in the best shape of anybody that I know. And I go, no, they're not. No, they're just muscular, right? And then an interview came out with Chris Evans for Captain America.
Oh, yeah.
And the scene you and I were talking about earlier today, on your left, right? He's running. And an interviewer asked him, so how much running did they have you doing prepping for Captain America? He said, oh, we don't do any running at all. He's like, if I were to run, I would burn off my muscle mass. He's like, so the only time that I run is for those takes. He's like, and I'm completely winded afterwards. He's like, I'm doubled over panting, because I'm so much heavier than I normally am. And, and I have no cardiovascular endurance, right? That's not being fit, but visually it's aesthetically pleasing, right? Yeah. You have the fitness models and a lot of the people, we won't mention any names, but people who are just famous for being famous, who have gotten caught on a regular basis, manipulating photos, right? Removing blemishes, trimming waists, doing all these different things, put out unrealistic images of what it means to be beautiful. And by extension, young, right? You don't see these people at whatever age trying to do the same thing. I've always been a bit of an odd duck, because I've always liked, I couldn't wait to be old when I was very young, 5 or 6. I built a little office under the stairs. I said I was an architect. My favorite characters are Obi-Wan Kenobi and Gandalf and all these other old guys, But I think paradoxically, having that mindset has helped me age thus far. And like I said earlier before we started recording, I think of myself as still being very young at 34. And so again, this is something a lot of listeners out there will have very mixed reactions. A lot of people say, 34, you're not young. And other people will say, yeah, you don't even have a right to talk about aging, right? So it's going to be all over the map. I understand that. But, what the science says, from the psychological research that I've done, this starts very early in life. This idea of your subjective perceptions of aging, your subjective perceptions of your functioning versus your peers functioning, all of these different things, they don't just suddenly spring up in later in life. It's operating throughout. And so as I've grown throughout life, I've always had this mindset that being old is going to be really cool, right? and there's some things that refute that, right? We were talking before the show. Yeah, my right knee is just never going to be right. It always clicks. It always pops. Yeah. And I can function 98% of the way that I would, but there's a 2% that's just it's never going to be right. That part of it's gone forever.
Yeah.
Rather than throwing a pity party, right? You just learn to adapt to it and you do what you can with it. But for the most part, this idea that being old is going to be really cool has completely panned out. Like I think that it's way cool. I think being 34 is the coolest that it's ever been, and and I think that that will continue to be the case, because not because I'll never face adversity or I'll ever face limitations or decline, but I think because I have the mindset that as those things pop up, I'm going to find ways to manage them, and I'm going to take advantage of the things that you get offered throughout life as you get older.
Yeah.
The crystalline knowledge, the ability to have experiences to draw on, the ability to do different things, right? And these are cumulative, right? As you go through life, you have these cumulative factors where what you tell yourself about old people, what you tell yourself about your age and your aging, tends to follow you throughout life and affect how that process goes. It's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways.
And more so, and clearly your research has expressed that, and it is so. I mean, I fully well realize, being a rational adult, that tomorrow something catastrophic could happen. I once have said to both of my adult children, there's a term, we don't have this, right? The adult children, because they're well, we don't, that, and I meant it. If my story in this plane of existence ends in a day, I have told you the most important things about how I regard you and how I feel about you. My granddaughter, my wife, my dear friends. I want to keep saying it, and I want to keep having adventures, and I want to keep doing those things. So it's not that. There's not this like Zen. Wow, I've got. I think Epicurus was right. We shouldn't fret so much about it. Those of us who are fortunate not to have to suffer constantly, I'm totally acknowledging that, because suffering, there's no joy in suffering. But in this condition, at this moment, is to be able to feel that way and to say, well, I'm not perfect, would have done some things differently, but I don't have lots of regrets. And I'm expressive enough to be able to say, this is how I am right now. This is the condition that I'm in. It's not a bad way to feel at this stage. I've got art to do. I've got more conversations to have. I've somebody to watch growing up, and everybody go. No, it's not wanting to leave. It's just saying, if I had to, it's been a fine adventure.
Yeah, and that's what I always say too, which is that, I've been alive for 34 years, but it seems like I've been alive forever. It seems like I've lived a really long, really good life. And so if I died tomorrow, right, everybody universally across the board would say, what a tragedy it is. Oh, he died so young. Oh, yeah. He had so much more that he could do, and that's true, right? Obviously I want to live to be old, but I think that there's, again, that your subjective experiences and how you look at how life has gone so far and how you're expecting it to go in the future, it plays a big role in how that future actually does unfold.
And I think that there's something to this, even though it may wax into the mystical or the spiritual or wherever it goes, but it's tied to ageism, in the sense that I think people, again, make assumptions about people who are old. I think people who are, as you grow older, you might cast a thought to death more often than younger people. Not people who have suicidal ideation, and I'm speaking for any of that kind of experience. But for myself, so you may think about it once in a while a little more. Have I planned? Have I done whatever whatever you can plan for, you do. But be grateful. Can you think of moment after moment after moment of things of relationships, of the people in your life, and I felt truly grateful and expressed that. That's a kind of youthening. Oh, I'm sure there are lots of young people who don't necessarily feel grateful about how things are for them right now for all kinds of reasons. But if you find that, I think that it doesn't require religious conversion or anything else. It just requires sometimes it's just good to say thank you.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because I was reading a study about that yesterday. They said that there's a specific point in time as people reach middle age where they suddenly stop thinking about how much time they've been alive, and they switch their mindset to how much time they have left. And that the attitudes they have towards that perspective shift plays a big role in how they develop into older people, right? Mm-hmm. And that is an interesting topic, because you're right. As you always think, oh, I'm 34 years old. I've been around for 34 years, right? But I don't think I'm 34 years old. Do I have 40 years left? 50 years left? 60, 30?
No, that way lies madness. That's a rabbit hole that tempts. And sometimes you slip down and sprain your ankle in it a little bit. And toward what end? I mean, it's
Right.
just like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, I don't want to watch what's going on now. I just want to know when I'm going to get to the end of the destination on the map. It's classic. Go on the throughway, go as fast as you can. Don't look at anything. Just get there.
Mm.
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
And nobody has any way of knowing. Do you think ageism will decrease as the population gets older and longevity increases?
I decrease, not necessarily. I think we set up all kinds of. There's a whole lot of attitudinal stuff that has to be worked through, because clearly, on a planetary scale, population growth is diminishing in large measure, not universally, but in many, many, many places. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for the planet, and it's certainly not bad. It's not a bad thing. But I think as people age, unless attitudes shift towards aging, unless this idea, which people my age embrace, sometimes differently. So, well, yeah, I'm going to retire because then I can just sit in the easy chair, and there's still that out there. I don't think nearly as much. A lot of people are working at Walmart or anywhere else that because they want to, or because they need to, because of finances or resources. But my he's 85, and he bakes cookies for people, and he's worked really hard at mobility, and he's not as mobile as he used to be, but he's worked really hard at having a relationship with his great granddaughter, such that now she recognizes and which is endlessly meaningful to him. But he also talks a lot about how it's not fun to get older, but that he often says, I've got to keep moving. I must keep moving, because what else is there? And in that, I think he means it's not just moving for the sake of moving, but it's moving because for the sake of still interacting with people and having relationships with people, which I think is why he's 85, and that and lots of medical help. But I just think we are going to we are in the process of so many things changing on this planet. It's always been change. Change is life. We know that, the truisms, but the population proportions are different. And I think that inevitably is going to lead to changes in attitude.
Yeah. I think it'll be very interesting, because I remember my dad saying something when he turned 40, and I remember him saying, man, I remember my dad when he was 40 and he was so old. He's like, and I don't think that I'm old. And I don't think my dad was old when he was 40 either. And then I think about my dad when he was 50, and I go, okay, well, he was starting to get old, but I still wouldn't think of him as old then, And so you see this progression, and you can look at pictures, photo albums, right, of your family, and go back and go, oh yeah, this was great grandpa, white hair and bald at the age of 37 or whatever. And then, each progressive generation seems to be less old. And so I think we see it happening all the time now in pop culture, which is not directly analogous, because these people have, less stressful lives and then other things that play into it. But I think by and large, I think that the pattern does hold, that people are aging better in conjunction with the population becoming older. I think that the most recent thing I read is that by 2050, the largest age demographic in the United States will be people 65 and older.
Mm-hmm.
And that's only going to get older, So you think this idea of ageism, of discriminating against specifically older people, it would have to give at some point if most people are older people, and if people are being biologically younger at more advanced ages, seems as if the attitudes would have to change.
I put to you that if using pop culture, that 2 generations ago in movies, there wouldn't be an adventure hero who's clearly old, Indiana Jones.
Hmm.
Who knows what that storyline for the new movie? I'm going to watch it. But what I like is while they use the technology to make him young for some scenes back, so decades earlier, some back and forth that's going on, the way you watch how he moves. Yeah, I think in the trailer, he's still doing impossible things for somebody who's 80, but not entirely impossible. But the fact of somebody in his 80s who is still seen as viable, I've got one more adventure in me. Well, maybe I have one more adventure after that or whatever. And Harrison Ford himself, who's none of us are paragons of virtue. I use the word paragon a lot lately because I've been hearing it more. No, I mean, who knows the complexity of marital relationships and all the rest of it? I'm not speaking to that, but speaking to the man as a craftsman who's is on a television show for the very first time. He's taken a Marvel contract. Then people say, well, he's doing it for the money. Well, maybe he's doing it for multiple alimonies, but I think he's doing it for something else too, which he expressed, which is he says, I want to work.
Yeah.
And I think I get that, Joel. That, doing this is not work in the same sense for some people, but it still is because I'm researching, we're thinking, we're talking.
Yeah, no, there's two very important things tied up there that are, in light of the research I did for my most recent paper, I think it's important to distinguish between. And the one is, yes, the ability and the want to work and to contribute and to be relevant. And I think that's something that is very important and should be recognized as an important part of people's lives at any age.
At any age, yes.
But the other thing that's tied up in there that I think is kind of interesting is when they were trying to determine if ageism was demographically or contextually based. And so, which is a way of saying they're trying to determine if a culture is ageism merely because old people exist, or whether a culture is ageism because there's attitudes that contribute to it. And what they found was that there's attitudes that contribute to it. And those attitudes, if you break it down, are cultural masculinity and long-term focus, which broken down even further is physicality, competitiveness, and the idea that you're looking at the long-term function of the country, so younger people play a more important part in that plan than older people. So, and the highest ranking country in terms of ageism was the United Kingdom, and I think the lowest was Ghana. And there was sort of a third to first world arc to it. And I think that, so you see that with Indiana Jones, right? They're not making a movie about him being a professor at 85, right? It wouldn't be. I
think there's a scene or two in there like they're
right. It might, and we all, we'll all admit that might not be as entertaining. You could make it. Yeah, I mean, you could make it some sort of mystery solving from the classroom. You could do that, but there's the masculinity part of it, right? We want to see him be physical. We want to see him be competitive, right? We have this thing, and what they found is those sorts of attitudes contribute to ageism, right? So if we see Harrison Ford, and and even if they're digitally making him do things that an 85-year-old can't, right? We're saying that yes, but we're not going to discriminate against him, not because he's old, but because he's old, but he can still be young. He can still do the things he can do when he's young.
Yes, and that can be dangerous. That's absolutely can be debilitating because that's back to what you were saying before. Well, we just never change.
Right.
Of course we do. I can't. I'm sure there are some people my age who could give you a good run when they're out there. Running has never been my thing, and so I run with my granddaughter, and that's good enough for me. But I do other exercise to keep myself reasonably fit. So I'm not Indiana Jones. I never was going to be Indiana Jones, but and that's not really the goal for me. But see, seeing that trailer, it wasn't that he's leaping across trains and running, and it's the in that trailer, this isn't an advertisement, but it was just really interesting. When he's talking about what belief is, there's this little monologue across the trailer. It ends up being having believing because you need to believe or something like that. And that sounds like energy of the kind that I can associate with.
And, I was
the internal energy.
Yeah. And I was using him mostly just as an example. I think in the trailer, they do acknowledge that he's old, and they do talk about how those days of adventuring are behind him, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that the movie's going into it glibly. I think that his age does play a part into how the character has developed and is going to be portrayed. But yeah, I think that the bigger picture and point is that what the important part of successful aging is functionality in whatever form that means to the person.
Yes.
Right? There can be old athletes.
Adaptive functionality.
Yes.
Using your adaptive word. Yeah.
Yeah. There's certainly old athletes that do very well. I was watching the Disney documentary series with Chris Hemsworth, Limitless, about aging.
Yeah.
And each episode they look at a different part of it. And for the strength episode, they had it was an 80, I think it was a bodybuilder, and I think that she was almost 90 years old. And you looked at her and you go, she could give anybody at any age a run for their money, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so certainly, physicality in and of itself is not a negative thing from an individual standpoint. Yeah. It's more the cultural standpoint that tends to, obfuscate and give meaning to things where it shouldn't be. But no, certainly, but I think the functionality is the important part. Right? Being able to do the things that are important to you.
I have a friend who is also, he's 84. He was a former professor. He lives in Florida. He's dear to me, as is his wife. His wife is younger than he, but she's my art teacher. They've been friends for decades. He's a former theater, drama professor. And we decided, later than I would have, I don't know why we decided, that we read a play each week. Plays, for the most part, that I never read. We've read through much of the work of Arthur Miller recently. And each week, every week and a half, we've set a time and we have an hour conversation. I learned so much from him. He says that it gives him joy to be able to keep doing this. And he's writing. Like you've been working on a novel. I know all the other stuff is going on in your life, but he's doing that, and it's an amazing piece of work. And as I said, he's 84. Arthur Miller was writing into his late 80s, writing plays. That was his last play. That people were writing into their 90s.
Roger Penrose,
yes,
head of he's one of the biggest titans in physics at 94, 6.
And still has some things to say. Mm-hmm. And probably himself would say, I'm not contributing to the field the way that somebody 20s, 30s, whatever, because of the plasticity, because of the new concepts and so on. But he still has things to offer. It's not about the relevance of trying to prove to the world that you can fix the world or anything like that. It's about do I still have something in some small way to add to this grand adventure, weird adventure, whatever this is. And I think if you lose that, that's going to hurt.
Yeah. It's been an interesting conversation, but I think that is the important part is looking at your life and not letting a number, whatever that number is, determine it. And not ignoring it, not pushing it aside, but knowing that as you get older, things will change, and realizing that no matter what that change entails, there's something in there that you can have a meaning, you can make a meaning of, that you can contribute to and kind of continue on. Until next time, keep on.